Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Ness-Deden, and today we are going to get into a little bit of chemistry. We've been talking the last few days about the process of photosynthesis and how energy moves through ecosystems. And today we're going to really kind of break that down and dig into the process of photosynthesis itself, and look at the molecules that plants need to take in, the atoms those molecules are made of, and a little bit of the chemistry of those molecules. And then within the next few days, we're going to talk about some of the plant structures that allow plants to take in what they need and release the things that they don't. So first, we're going to start by reviewing a little bit of chemistry. Take a minute and look at the three diagrams that you have up on the screen right now. These are three different ways that you can represent a molecule. And if you look carefully, you'll notice these are all the same molecule. They're all different representations of one pentanol, but they're drawn in different ways. This one is a ball and stick model. This one is a Lewis structure. And this one on the right is a line drawing. And so I just want to take a minute looking at these to make sure that you understand how to interpret these different kinds of drawings, because you'll see these as we start getting into some biochemistry, both right now, and then it'll come back a little bit later. The first thing I want you to notice, this molecule is made of three different elements. It's made of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And as you look at this, you'll notice that those elements each form different numbers of bonds. If we look at the Lewis structure here in the middle, it's kind of easiest to see there since all the elements are labeled for us and the bonds are all drawn. You can see that every carbon atom forms 4 bonds with the atoms around it. Every oxygen forms 2 bonds. There's only 1 in here, but it's got 2 bonds. And each hydrogen atom only forms 1. If you remember a little bit back from chemistry, the reason that different elements form different numbers of bonds has to do with their electron configuration. So these are just some drawings of kind of the arrangement of the electrons in an atom. And atoms form bonds in order to complete their valence shell, that outer level. And so you can see, like, letter C on here is an atom of oxygen. It has 8 total electrons. And you can see in that outer level, there are kind of 2 available openings. There are 2 places where you have these single electrons. And those are the places where a bond can form. This atom needs 2 more electrons to complete its valence shell. Therefore, it will form 2 chemical bonds. Others, like letter D, only has 1 open spot in that outer level, so it's only going to form 1 chemical bond. So that's kind of the chemical explanation for why different elements form different numbers of bonds. Now I want to spend just a little more time looking at this line drawing, the one on the right. Keep in mind, this is the exact same molecule as the drawing in the middle and the drawing on the left, but you can see it looks much, much simpler. You'll see a lot of these drawings in biology just because it's kind of the quickest and easiest way to represent an atom, to represent a molecule. When you look at this, since this is, sorry, I hit the wrong button again. I keep doing that. There you go. Since this is the same molecule on the right, it still contains all the same atoms that are in one pentanol in the other 2 drawings. It's the same thing. We just kind of skip over drawing some of them. But if you look at this structure, first of all, you'll notice the backbone of the molecule is drawn kind of with this little zigzag line right here. In the Lewis structure, you can see that center line going from the hydrogen on the left all the way to the OH on the right is a big long chain of carbon atoms. In a line drawing, every place that the line bends, so right here at the corner and right here, represents a carbon. And so if you want, you can kind of draw those in so that you can see the whole structure of that molecule. You can also see that all these extra hydrogens on the sides are missing from that line drawing. And again, that's just to simplify it and make it easier to look at. You know that carbon forms 4 chemical bonds always. And so we can fill in the rest of the hydrogens on this if we want to, because we know this carbon right here is already bonded to the carbon next to it here and here, that's 2. But there's 2 other spaces, so it has to have 2 other hydrogens. So there would be a hydrogen there and a hydrogen here. So if we wanted to, we could go back through and fill this all in. Those are basically implied. The reason they're not shown is the parts of a molecule that are involved in chemical reactions usually aren't those carbon-hydrogen chains through the middle. The parts that are usually involved in chemical reactions are what we call functional groups, which are these kind of special little clusters of atoms that are found in the molecule that are shown specifically. So that's kind of the simplified way that you will see a lot of molecules drawn as we get into some biochemistry. And so it's just important to remember that all those other atoms are still in there, even if you don't see every single one. All right. So take a minute and look at this vocab list. These are all words that you learned in chemistry. Some of them you may remember better than others because you've learned them a few times. Take a minute and pause the video and look up any words that you are less familiar with. Some of these we will be reviewing a little bit more together as we get into this part of the unit as well. Later today, you're going to spend some more time learning about polarity and electronegativity. And so if you're a little rusty on those, don't worry about it so much. We're going to talk about those quite a bit today. We're also going to review a little bit right now about covalent bonds, and you'll be talking more about hydrogen bonds a little bit later as well. So those are kind of the ones we're going to focus in on today, but you'll hear all of these words coming up as we start talking about this. The other thing that you are going to start hearing about in here, I'm going to hide my picture so you can see that whole thing, is something called emergent properties. As we move up, we looked a few days ago at these levels of organization, going from atoms that build molecules, molecules build cells, and so on all the way up to the ecology levels that we've been talking about. We talk about these things called emergent properties. Emergent properties are properties that appear at the bigger levels of organization that didn't exist before. So here are some examples of kind of what that means, because it happens all throughout these different levels. So if we look at the level of a population, populations have some properties like density and dispersion. You can say how packed together the organisms are within a population. Those are things that you can't talk about if you only have one organism. It just simply doesn't make sense. They don't exist at that level. That's something that emerges once you have a population. Another example is trophic structure, which we've talked about the last few days. Communities have trophic structure. You have producers and consumers and secondary consumers and so on. But one single population, if all you're talking about is the population of bees, they don't have trophic structure. You need those other organisms involved in order to have that property. When we talk about chemistry, some examples are down here, the differences between atoms and molecules. Atoms of sodium by itself is a metal. Chlorine by itself is a poisonous gas. But if we connect those together to make this ionic compound, we get salt, which is not a poisonous gas and it's not a metal. It has very, very different properties. And the one we're going to focus in on today is water. Hydrogen and oxygen by themselves are just atoms. They don't have any particularly special properties. But when we put them together to make water, water has this very special property called polarity, which gives it all of the other amazing properties it has and makes it super important to living things. As we start talking about water, we are going to talk a lot about that idea of polarity. And polarity happens as a result of the covalent bonds that form between the hydrogen and oxygen atoms. When they form that bond, hydrogen and oxygen atoms share their electrons. That's what forms a covalent bond in order to complete their valence shell, to get those full shell of electrons around the outside of the atom. The reason that bond is unique in a water molecule is because of a property called electronegativity. And that's basically how much atoms pull on electrons, how strongly they attract electrons towards themselves. If the atoms, in this case hydrogen and oxygen, have unequal electronegativity, in other words, one of them is pulling a lot harder than the other, then you get a polar covalent bond. The electrons are not shared equally. In biology, the most important atoms that you need to know about in terms of electronegativity are hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. Those are some of the most common atoms in living organisms. And many of the biomolecules that we'll talk about in this class are made predominantly of those four elements. And so the electronegativities of those four are kind of the most important ones to remember. So this is a really important thing that you will see again and again and again, and that you should memorize. This is really all you need to know about electronegativity for biology. Oxygen is the most electronegative element that is commonly found in living things. It is more electronegative than nitrogen, that's the second most, and nitrogen is more electronegative than carbon or hydrogen. Carbon and hydrogen are roughly equivalent in terms of electronegativity, at least as far as biological molecules are concerned. Um, so some examples of polar covalent bonds would be anything that's like a bond between nitrogen and hydrogen, or oxygen and hydrogen, like in a water molecule, or a nitrogen carbon bond, anywhere where the two are not equivalent. But if you have a nitrogen-nitrogen bond, obviously they're the same electronegativity, that would be nonpolar. Or say a carbon-hydrogen bond is nonpolar because they're roughly equivalent in their electronegativity. So we're going to take these ideas now and we're going to apply them to probably the most important molecule in biology, this molecule of water. You are going to head off now and watch an 8-minute video from Mr. Anderson, one of the Bozeman biology videos, talking about water and why it's a polar molecule and some of the properties it has because it's a polar molecule that make it so important to life. That video will be linked in the comment that'll pop up on this video in just a second. And then you're going to go and drop some water on a penny, like I told you before you left class on Tuesday. If you are a House A student, you're going to collect some data for us for a lab that we're going to be working on together tomorrow. So have fun doing your little at-home data collection, and I hope you have a great day.